The etched copper plate gleamed beneath the focused beam of my desk lamp, a miniature world rendered with the precision of a celestial chart. Each contour line, each ancient river's serpentine path, was a testament to hours of painstaking cross-referencing, of coaxing truths from faded parchment and brittle vellum. I, Reid, found solace in the absolute certainty of a completed map, in the elegant logic of geometry applied to the untamed earth. My fingers, accustomed to the delicate touch of a fine stylus, traced the almost imperceptible rise of a forgotten hillock, a feature only visible when one merged the conflicting reports of three distinct 17th-century surveyors. This was my life's quiet devotion, to pull order from the chaos of history, to give form to the formless past. The shrill, insistent trill of my phone, a sound usually relegated to the periphery of my consciousness, ripped through the quiet sanctity of my office. It was the solicitor, his voice a dry rustle of paper and obligation, informing me of an unexpected inheritance. A distant branch of the family tree had withered, leaving behind an ancestral estate, remote and, by his careful phrasing, considerably rustic. Later that evening, the news still settling like a strange dust in my mind, I found myself navigating the foggy parking garage where footsteps echoed too long. The air hung heavy and damp, smelling of exhaust fumes and forgotten rain. Each step I took sent a hollow clap resounding into the vast, concrete cavern, the sound stretching, warping, and then finally fading into a silence that felt deeper than any I had known. My own breath plumed before me, a ghost in the humid chill. The solicitor's words, a place untouched by time, echoed with an unsettling resonance in that cavernous space, promising more than just antiquity. They promised stagnation, decay, perhaps even a kind of forgotten malevolence. The journey north was a slow dissolution of the familiar. Highways gave way to country roads, asphalt to gravel, and eventually, the very concept of a well-maintained path seemed to vanish entirely. The landscape grew starker, trees gnarled and skeletal against a perpetually bruised sky. My small car, usually so reliable, felt like a fragile shell against the encroaching wildness. The last few miles were a torturous crawl up a track so overgrown it felt less like a road and more like a scar on the earth's face. Then, through a sudden parting of ancient, skeletal oaks, it appeared. The estate. The air itself seemed heavy, laden with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, something metallic and faintly acrid that I couldn't quite place. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light that pierced the grimy windows, illuminating the spectral draperies and shrouded furniture. The solicitor had mentioned a study, where the family's papers were kept. I found it eventually, a vast chamber at the back of the house, its shelves groaning under the weight of leather-bound volumes and stacked boxes. It was in a heavy, iron-bound chest, tucked beneath a pile of mildewed deeds and a tarnished silver locket, that I found it. The map. I unrolled it carefully on the vast, dust-sheeted mahogany table, my fingers brushing against the surprisingly supple vellum. It was large, perhaps 3 feet by 4, and clearly ancient, the parchment bearing the faint, spiderweb cracks of centuries. Its edges were ragged in places, but the central image remained remarkably preserved. At first glance, it was breathtaking, an intricate depiction of the estate and its surrounding lands, rendered with a master cartographer's touch. Every stream, every coppice, every undulation of the terrain was etched with an exquisite, almost obsessive detail. I could identify landmarks, even the approximate location of the house itself, marked with a tiny, stylized spire. The hand that drew this map possessed an almost divine understanding of the land. But as my eyes traveled across its surface, a prickle of unease began to trace its way up my spine. The map was incomplete. Vast sections, particularly towards the northern and western boundaries of the property, dissolved into blank, uninked spaces, as if the cartographer had abruptly ceased work or had simply refused to chart those particular areas. And then there were the symbols. They were unlike any cartographic symbols I had ever encountered, jagged, angular forms that seemed to writhe on the vellum, resembling neither known script nor conventional markers. Some resembled twisted branches, others fragmented bones, and one, near the largest blank expanse, was a swirling vortex, almost hypnotic in its simplicity, yet profoundly disturbing. And what unspeakable features did those strange symbols denote? I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I had to complete this map. I drove away, the city lights receding in my rearview mirror like embers dying in a hearth. The journey north was a slow unraveling, the world outside my window shedding its sharp edges, softening into an expanse of ancient trees and rolling, mist-shrouded hills. The estate, when I finally reached it after hours of driving, rose from the land not as a monument, but as a scar. Its remoteness was absolute, a quality that both soothed and unsettled me. A long, winding track, barely more than a pair of muddy ruts, led me through a tunnel of skeletal elms, their bare branches clawing at the gray sky. The house itself was a hulking silhouette against the twilight, its slate roof sagging like a weary spine, its windows dark, vacant eyes. Peeling paint, the color of dried blood and faded moss, flaked from the timber frames, revealing the raw, weathered wood beneath. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, wrestled with the stone, its tendrils slowly strangling the very life from the walls. I parked the car, the crunch of gravel beneath the tires the only sound to break the profound quiet. Clutching the inherited map, its vellum brittle and yellowed, I began my initial reconnaissance. My cartographer's eye, trained to seek order and precision, immediately registered the discrepancies. This wasn't just a dilapidated property, it was a landscape at odds with itself. The map, hand-drawn with exquisite detail, depicted features that simply weren't there on the modern land deeds I'd studied. And, more unsettlingly, it hinted at things that seemed to defy physical presence. I walked the perimeter, my boots sinking into the sodden ground. To the east, where the map indicated an old gardener's cottage, I found only a mound of tumbled stones, entirely swallowed by a riot of thorny brambles and tangled ivy. Yet, the map's lines were so precise, the small, shaded rectangles so definitive, it felt as though the cottage still existed, merely hidden beneath a shroud of vegetation. My fingers traced the outline on the fragile paper, the texture of the aged ink surprisingly rough beneath my touch. Further north, past a grove of gnarled oaks, the map marked a sunken courtyard. There, the trees grew denser, their canopies so thick that the light, even in the afternoon, seemed to die. I looked down to find a cluster of rough-hewn stone markers, half buried in the leaf litter. They were not grave markers, nor boundary stones. They were too irregular, too crudely shaped, and arranged in an arcane geometry that defied any practical purpose. One stood taller than the rest, its surface scarred with ancient, indecipherable gouges, almost like forgotten script. I ran my hand over the cool, rough face of the stone, feeling the faint vibrations of something beneath the earth, a sustained, low hum that resonated through my fingertips, then up my arm. It was too subtle to be a natural phenomenon, too steady to be the wind. It was not the rustle of leaves, for the branches above me were motionless. It was a sound that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the estate, a breath exhaled from the land itself. My cartographer's logic, usually my anchor, began to fray at the edges. My mind, accustomed to the elegant certainties of lines and coordinates, wrestled with these. Unsettling anomalies. The discrepancies between the map and the physical landscape were more than mere oversight or decay. They hinted at a hidden reality, a layer beneath the visible world. This was not just an estate to be catalogued and settled. This was a place that held its secrets jealously, a place that seemed to actively resist understanding. And I, with my ancient map and my surveyor's tools, had just begun to scratch at its surface. The hum beneath the stone markers seemed to deepen, a low thrum that vibrated not just in my hand, but through the soles of my boots, into the earth, and perhaps, into something deeper still within me. The vast, echoing space had filled me with a peculiar emptiness, a premonition of the void that awaited. Now, the landscape blurred past, a verdant tapestry slowly giving way to gnarled, ancient trees that clawed at a bruised sky. The gates, rusted lacework swallowed by ivy, groaned a protest as I pushed them open. The house itself emerged from the gloom like a sleeping beast, its windows vacant eyes staring out from a face of weather-beaten stone. It was larger than I'd imagined, a sprawling monument to forgotten grandeur, each turret and gable a testament to a time long past. My cartographer's mind, so accustomed to the precise geometry of grids and contours, immediately sought to impose order. I began by meticulously unpacking, arranging my tools, my books, my maps, each item placed with deliberate care. I told myself the creaks and groans of the old house were merely the settling of ancient timbers, the wind whistling through ill-fitting panes. The isolation was a luxury, a perfect environment for uninterrupted work. Yet, even in the full light of day, a subtle unease began to curdle the air. It was like a trick of the light, a consequence of tired eyes, I reasoned. My logical brain dismissed it, but a small, insistent tremor in my nerves remained. At first, I attributed them to the old plumbing, the drafts, the settling of the foundation. But they persisted, a low, sibilant murmur that seemed to emanate from the very walls, a breathy cadence just beyond the grasp of understanding. I would pause, straining to decipher the sound, convinced for a moment that words were forming, only for it to dissipate into the general hush of the house. It was maddening, this auditory phantom, making me question my own perception. Then came the small, disquieting shifts. A book I was certain I'd left on my desk would appear on the shelf, slightly out of place. A teacup, rinsed and inverted on the draining board, would be righted, a faint ring of moisture beneath it. Each instance was minor, easily dismissed as my own absent-mindedness or a lapse in memory. I was under stress, I told myself. The enormity of the inheritance, the remote location, the sheer age of the house, it was all taking a toll. But the occurrences accumulated, a mosaic of tiny discrepancies that began to prickle at the edges of my rational facade. My meticulous nature, which once brought me solace, now only amplified the unsettling pattern. The nightmares were the worst. I dreamt of being buried alive beneath layers of soil, the weight crushing me, not with physical force, but with an ancient, suffocating sorrow. These dreams were not merely images, they were sensations, emotions, an infiltration of something deeply primordial into my sleep. It lay spread across the heavy oak table, its parchment yellowed, its lines precise, yet incomplete. I had been studying a particular section, an area of the estate marked only by a vague, almost smudged contour line. I remembered its exact appearance, the faintness of the ink, the uncertainty of its shape. But now, as my lamp cast its focused glow, a new detail asserted itself. A series of minuscule, almost microscopic symbols, like archaic pictograms, had subtly surfaced along that contour. They were not drawn on top, but seemed to have bled up from within the very fibers of the paper, as if the parchment itself was weeping secrets. The ink had deepened, the lines sharpened, and the vague smudge now resolved into a distinct, unsettling pattern. It was a pattern I had never seen before, yet it felt disturbingly familiar, like an echo from a forgotten corner of my own memory. This was not a trick of the light. This was not my imagination. The map, my anchor to the tangible world, was changing, revealing something it had previously withheld, something that spoke of hidden depths and untold horrors. Now, the landscape blurred past, a fleeting tapestry of greens and grays, but the image of those endless concrete pillars, swallowed by an unnatural mist, remained etched behind my eyes. I gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, the need for answers a clawing urgency in my chest. Back within its crumbling embrace, the house felt different. Not merely old, but aware. The air, thick with the scent of decaying wood and forgotten lives, seemed to press in, a silent companion to my frantic search. I bypassed the grand, echoing chambers, my instincts drawing me to a seldom-used antechamber adjoining the library, a small, windowless space I'd previously dismissed as a glorified storage closet. Now, its locked door, hidden behind a tapestry depicting a hunting scene, beckoned with a peculiar insistence. The key, found months ago tucked into the spine of a forgotten almanac, slid into the tumblers with a rusty sigh, yielding to the pressure. Inside, dust motes danced in the single shaft of light filtering from a crack in the tapestry, illuminating shelves crammed with leather-bound volumes, brittle manuscripts, and stacks of yellowed correspondence. I began to sift through the chaos, my fingers growing stained with grime, my breath catching in my throat with each unearthed relic. The earliest, dated to the late 17th century, began with meticulous entries detailing agricultural yields and weather patterns. But as the pages turned, the script grew erratic, the observations veering into increasingly paranoid accounts. "The land demands," one entry scrawled, "a reckoning." Over centuries, started sane, then descended into a particular kind of delirium, often preceding their disappearance. Then came the letters. A stack bound with faded ribbon, addressed to various family members from concerned relatives. "Our cousin, Eleanor, has not been herself since she began her walks by the old spring," one penned in the elegant hand of the early 1800s read. "She speaks of voices, of visions in the water. She vanished last week, leaving only her shawl by the stone circle." Another, from a generation later, lamented a great-uncle's sudden, violent fits of rage, his obsession with the markings on the map, before he too, simply ceased to be. I spread my incomplete map across a cleared space on the dusty table, comparing the cryptic entries to the faint, almost invisible symbols I'd painstakingly traced. The old spring, the stone circle, they were there, marked with an unsettling precision. Other locations, previously meaningless symbols, now began to resonate with the madness documented in the journals. A grim cartography of despair. The map wasn't just a survey of the estate, it was a chronicle of its victims, a blueprint of its malevolence. These weren't isolated incidents of mental decline or unfortunate accidents. This was a recurring, generational plague, tied to specific, ancient points on the land itself. The journals, the letters, the folklore whispered in faded ink, they all pointed to a terrible truth: the estate wasn't merely haunted, it was a hungry, living thing, and my ancestors had been its unwitting shepherds, or perhaps, its offerings. A draft snaked through the room, though no window was open, raising gooseflesh on my arms. I saw my own name, Reid, written in the margin of a late 19th century journal, a genealogical note. Below it, a scrawled addendum in a different, frantic hand: "He will come." The blood calls. My breath hitched. The map wasn't just a guide. It was a key. A key to something ancient, something that had consumed my lineage, and now, with my meticulous hand completing its design, it was turning in the lock. I was not just researching history, I was awakening it. And I was next. The grim cartography of despair I'd unearthed clung to my mind, each dot on the ancient parchment a ghost, each line a drawn-out breath. The map was no mere survey, it was a testament, a ledger of suffering etched into the very fabric of the estate. I traced the faded ink, the patterns of descent, the chilling symmetry of their ends, and a cold certainty settled in my bones. This was a generational hunger, an ancient, cyclical appetite. Sleep offered no respite, only a deeper plunge into the harrowing tapestry the map had begun to weave in my subconscious. I would stare at the intricate lines of the unfinished chart, and in the corner of my eye, a fleeting shape would coalesce, a woman's face, etched with a terror that transcended centuries, or the small, desperate reach of a child's hand, transparent as smoke. These weren't just memories of my dreams, they were intrusions, stark and unbidden, into the stark light of day. They were no longer the wind sighing through the eaves or the house settling into its decay. They spoke my name first, a drawn-out, sibilant sound that scraped against my nerves like rusted metal. The glass vibrated, not from my tremor, but with an internal shudder. A stack of carefully catalogued historical documents, piled neatly on the oak desk, suddenly slid, scattering across the polished floorboards with a soft, papery sigh. I froze, my breath catching. Later that evening, a sharp rap sounded at my study door. I called out, my voice thin and reedy. No answer. I waited, every nerve strung tight. I moved towards the door, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. As I reached for it, the door swung inward with a violent, unseen force, slamming back against the wall with a splintering crack. Desperation gnawed at me. I needed to speak to someone, anyone, who could offer a shred of rational explanation, a thread to pull me back from the precipice of madness. My phone, a stubborn anachronism in this decaying estate, felt like my last link to sanity. I dialed the local sheriff, a pragmatic man whose voice I hoped would ground me. The line crackled, then went dead, a flat, mocking tone. I tried a former colleague, a historical researcher known for his dry wit and even drier skepticism. The call connected, but static swallowed my words, twisting them into unintelligible gibberish. I decided to drive into the nearest town, to a public place, anywhere that offered a semblance of normal life. The fog here was not natural, it swirled with an unnatural density, clinging to the grimy pillars and obscuring the farthest rows of parked vehicles. I gripped my phone, pressing it to my ear, trying one last time to reach my colleague. The line was dead. Utterly, irrevocably dead. The fog began to coalesce, swirling into indistinct shapes between the parked cars, like phantom spectators. The outside world had offered no solace, no escape, only a confirmation of the inescapable. The entity wasn't merely confined to the decaying walls, its tendrils reached, its influence stretched, encompassing everything I touched, everything I saw. Returning to the house was like stepping back into the maw of a beast. The map lay on my desk, now seeming to pulse with a faint, malevolent light, its lines no longer just ink, but pathways for something ancient and hungry. Your turn, Reid. Your turn. I was trapped, utterly alone, the next victim etched onto a map that had always, it seemed, been waiting for me. The drive back to the estate was a blur of terror and resignation. I felt its subtle seep into the very marrow of my bones, a cold, patient settling. Its silence was no longer merely quiet, it was expectant, a profound hush that pressed against my eardrums. Sleep was a forgotten luxury, a distant memory of a life I no longer inhabited. I returned to my study, the map spread out beneath the flickering gaslight, its parchment a pale, accusing skin. My fingers, trembling with a nervous energy that bordered on fever, traced the delicate lines, the faded contours. The cryptic annotations, once merely curiosities, now pulsed with a sinister significance. I had dismissed them as ancestral quirks, the ramblings of eccentric forebears. Now, I saw a pattern in their frantic script, a desperate language trying to claw its way out of the past. For hours, perhaps days, I lost myself in the labyrinthine details. My eyes burned, blurring the intricate crosshatching, the peculiar symbols that repeated themselves with unnerving frequency. The air grew heavy, pressing down on my chest, making each inhale a shallow effort. The house itself seemed to hold its breath with me. I compared the map to the few remaining family journals, their brittle pages crumbling at my touch, releasing the musty aroma of forgotten secrets. Beside them, scrawled in a hand that bore an unsettling resemblance to my own, was a phrase in an archaic dialect I barely recognized, a dialect my grandfather had often murmured in his cups. It spoke of the deep slumber, the binding earth, and the thinning veil. The lines on the map, the meticulously drawn boundaries and unusual formations, were not paths to a hidden treasure, nor were they architectural blueprints for some forgotten structure. They were a cage. A prison. The estate was not merely built upon the land, it was built around something, a vast, intricate warding. The hidden features I had sought were not physical objects, but the very scenes of this containment, points of reinforcement, points of vulnerability. The entire property, with its crumbling walls and overgrown gardens, was a colossal, ancient lock. And the key, or perhaps the mechanism for its undoing, lay in the very map I held. This wasn't a ghost, not a phantom of the past. It was something far older, something primal and vast, an entity buried deep beneath the earth, beneath the very foundations of my ancestral home. They were symptoms of a slow, agonizing rupture. My ancestors, I understood now, were not merely landholders, they were wardens, their lineage bound to this sacred, terrible duty. And I, Reid, the meticulous cartographer, had been drawn here, not by chance, but by the insidious pull of that same bloodline. I was not an inheritor, I was a successor. The map, once a symbol of intellectual pursuit, transformed into a terrifying mandate. I was here to complete it, to understand it, perhaps to shore up the failing defenses, to reinforce the prison. Or, worse, my arrival, my very attempts to complete the map, were inadvertently hastening its release. Was I the last guardian, or the unwitting executioner? A sudden, overwhelming urge to flee seized me. To run, to drive until the engine seized and the world spun into oblivion. I stumbled out of the study, blindly grabbing my keys. I fumbled with the ignition, the engine sputtering to life with a reluctant cough. I drove, not knowing where, only away. There was no escape. The map, the seal, the ancient entity, it was all me now. And I was trapped. The world outside the estate had promised a fleeting reprieve, a fragile illusion of normalcy, but it had betrayed me. Even miles away, the weight of the land, the pressure of what lay beneath, pressed down. I felt its gaze, a prickling awareness that crawled across my skin, a whisper just beyond the threshold of hearing that followed my every step. My journey into the city was a desperate, ill-conceived attempt to find answers that the estate's dusty archives hadn't yielded. I sought a specific, obscure text, rumored to contain forgotten local folklore, tucked away in the deepest recesses of a city library's special collections. A low-hanging mist, unnatural even for the damp city air, swirled around my ankles, obscuring the faded yellow lines on the pavement. You return, Reid. I spun, my eyes frantically scanning the swirling mist, but there was nothing. Only the spectral outlines of parked vehicles, hulking, silent sentinels lost in the haze. The voice was not in the air, but of the air. Resonating in the very structure of the concrete around me, amplified by the endless echo. The blood calls. This was no longer the subtle, insidious influence of the estate. This was direct, undeniable. You seek to mend what cannot be mended. To bury what hungers. The words were no longer just thoughts, they manifested as a low thrumming in my bones, a vibration that shook my teeth. My stomach churned, a knot of ice and fire. I clamped my hands over my ears, a futile gesture against a sound that originated within me, yet felt utterly alien. It has always been thus. A vessel. A vision, sharp and brutal, flashed behind my eyes, not of blood, but of a slow, agonizing draining, a leaching of vitality, of spirit, until only an empty husk remained. It wasn't my physical death it craved, but something far more intimate, more terrifying. My very essence. My will. My identity. It wanted to consume the cartographer, to absorb the meticulous mind that had sought to chart its prison, and in doing so, finally break free. Panic clawed at my throat. The entity was attempting to possess me, to lure me into surrendering, to become its willing instrument. The garage's echoes twisted, forming a chorus of mocking, sibilant voices, each one a fragment of the overarching demand. Join us. Release us. A single, distinct image from the incomplete map I had labored over, a forgotten detail I dismissed as a mere stylistic flourish. A series of interlocking symbols, almost microscopic, etched into the border of the oldest section, near the very heart of the estate. They resembled a chain, but also a complex knot. It wasn't decorative. It was a lock. A binding. The entity's voice, though still pervasive, faltered, a momentary ripple in its overwhelming presence. It was as if my sudden insight had struck a chord of dissonance in its very being. Fool. You understand nothing. There is no escape. Only submission. But I did understand. The symbols, I now realized, were not just a representation of containment, but a ritualistic instruction. A way to reseal what had been unleashed, to reinforce the ancient bonds. My ancestors, the very ones who had charted the land and inadvertently bound the entity, had also left the means to contain it. But the image in my mind came with a searing, intuitive certainty. The ritual required a profound act of will, a personal sacrifice that went beyond mere physical exertion. It demanded a part of myself, not for the entity to consume, but to fuel the rebinding. The stakes became terrifyingly clear. This wasn't just about my sanity, or even my life. The entity, once fully free, would not merely inhabit the estate. Its influence stretched, its hunger was vast. It would consume the land, twist its very nature, and then reach beyond, an insidious blight spreading from the heart of the ancient property. The fate of everything I knew, everything that lay beyond the decaying walls, rested on my ability to complete this horrifying, necessary task.
I knew the price.
I was no longer merely a cartographer.
I was a custodian,
A jailer.
and a potential sacrifice.
My ancestors, the very ones who had charted the land and inadvertently bound the entity, had also. They had left the solution.
A desperate, final act.
The map, now complete in my mind, pulsed with a cold, insistent geometry. It showed me the way, not just across the land, but into it. The air in the study felt thin, as if the very oxygen had been leached away by the weight of my revelation. My hand, trembling with a strange mix of terror and resolve, traced the final, unholy lines on the parchment.
This was it. The descent.
I moved with the grim purpose of a condemned man walking to the gallows, yet within me, a flicker of defiance burned. I would not be another victim. I would be the one to finish what they started, to mend the tear in the fabric of this place. Behind a crumbling stone wall, masked by decades of ivy and a cleverly disguised hinge, I found it, the entrance. It grated on rusted hinges with a sound like a tortured
moan, revealing a maw of absolute blackness.
No light penetrated its depths. Only the map, now etched into my memory, provided a guide. The first few steps were tentative, my boots scuffing against unseen stone. It was the entity, roused, aware of my intrusion. Then, the world twisted. The rough-hewn walls of the passage dissolved, replaced by a sudden, disorienting vista of concrete columns and fluorescent hum. I stood in a vast, sprawling space, the air thick with the sickly sweet scent of exhaust fumes and the metallic tang of damp concrete. This was a trick, a cruel illusion woven by the entity, a desperate attempt to disorient me, to make me doubt the reality of my purpose. My heart hammered, but a core of ice remained, anchoring me. I closed my eyes, focusing on the cold stone beneath my feet, the damp smell of the crypt. The garage shimmered, then dissolved, replaced by the suffocating blackness of the passage once more. I pushed on, my resolve hardening with each illusion overcome. This burden is not yours, Reid, they hissed, let it be.
Sleep. Forget. But I could not. The faces of my ancestors, gaunt and terrified, flashed behind my eyelids.
The path grew treacherous. Loose scree shifted beneath my weight, threatening to send me tumbling into unseen chasms. The floor became uneven, slick with an oily moisture, and I felt inexplicable gusts of wind, frigid and foul, attempting to push me back, to throw me off balance. A section of the ceiling groaned, a shower of pebbles cascading down, narrowly missing my head. The entity was actively fighting me, its malice a palpable force, a clawing desperation. These were the binding symbols, the ancient wards. They were weakening, frayed by time and neglect, but they were still there, still a guide. They showed me the way, deeper and deeper, towards the heart of the corruption. The air grew thick, not just with damp earth, but with something else, a scent like ozone and decay, a smell that scraped at the back of my throat and made my eyes water. My head throbbed, a relentless drumbeat against my skull, but I kept moving. I could feel the entity's presence now, vast and malevolent, directly ahead. Not with my eyes, but with a deeper, more primal sense.
My destination.
The place where the ritual must be performed. The air here was alive with a terrible, silent scream. Dots slick with a viscous film that clung to my boots, threatening to drag me into the unseen. My breath rasped, a raw sound in the oppressive stillness. I pressed on, my hands scraping against rough, cold rock, until the passage abruptly widened.
The confined tunnel gave way to a vast, echoing space, shrouded in a pervasive mist.
This was the place.
Concrete pillars, thick as ancient trees, rose from the slick floor, disappearing into the swirling vapor above. It was not empty.
I felt it, a profound and terrible presence that saturated the very air, a weight on my chest, an icy claw around my throat. It was not a creature of flesh and bone, but a malevolence woven into the fabric of this place, an ancient hunger that had festered beneath the earth for centuries. It pulsed, a silent thrumming in my skull, and I knew it was aware of me. It was my own voice, twisted, mocking, laced with the despair of 1,000 forgotten souls. To complete what your bloodline began. My hands tightened around the rolled map I clutched, the parchment now damp and pliable. My cartographer's instinct, honed by years of deciphering arcane symbols and forgotten boundaries, was screaming. The entity sought to disorient, to drown me in fear, but I would not yield. I found the central pillar, marked on the map with a faded, almost invisible sigil. Its concrete surface was slick with condensation, weeping with the perpetual damp. The entity's presence intensified, pressing against me like a physical force. Your ancestors tried. They failed. Their blood still screams for release. But I saw past the illusion. My focus narrowed to the map, to the precise lines and symbols I had painstakingly completed. The entities. Weakness was not in brute force, but in its definition. It was bound by the very geometry of the land, by the ley lines and forgotten markers that my family had sought to contain, and inadvertently, had helped to unleash. The map, I now understood, was not merely a record, it was a cage, a blueprint for its containment. The final lines, the ones I had added, glowed faintly in my mind's eye, imbued with a purpose I had only just begun to grasp. I pulled out the chalk I had brought, a piece of white stone harvested from the estate's deepest quarry, chosen for its unique mineral composition, a detail noted in a forgotten margin of the family grimoire. I began to draw, tracing the intricate patterns, the binding sigils, onto the pillar. The chalk scraped, a dry, grating sound that was swallowed by the vastness, it seemed to echo endlessly in my ears. The entity shrieked, a soundless scream that vibrated through the very marrow of my bones, threatening to shatter my resolve. My fingers cramped, my arm ached, but I pressed on. The map's lines were not merely lines, they were conduits, channels for the Earth's own slumbering energy, meant to draw the entity's dispersed essence back to a single point, to bind it once more within the land. I had to complete the final circuit, the last, intricate knot in this cartographic prison. Visions of endless, desolate landscapes, of a sunless sky and a world devoid of life, flashed before my eyes. This was the entity's true nature, its ultimate desire. It wanted to unmake Dot. You cannot win, it hissed, its voice now a cacophony of overlapping screams and pleas, a chorus of its past victims. You are just one man, a flicker against an eternal night. But I was Reid, the cartographer. My mind, trained in precision, in the absolute truth of lines and angles, held firm. It was trying to overwhelm me, but it was also reacting to my actions. The ritual was working. I reached the final point on the pillar, the last intersection of lines, the apex of the binding symbol. My hand shook violently, but I steadied it, focusing all my will, all my knowledge, into that single, precise stroke. As the chalk completed the circuit, a low hum resonated through the concrete, a deep, resonant tone that seemed to come from the very earth itself. The fog, which had been churning, began to settle, revealing the damp, stained concrete walls of the garage. The spectral figures vanished, leaving only the silent, unyielding pillars. I stood there, panting, my body racked with tremors. The chalk fell from my numb fingers, clattering softly on the slick floor.
The ritual was done.
The entity was contained, bound once more to the earth it had plagued. But the victory felt hollow, a whisper in a vast, empty chamber. I looked at the completed symbol on the pillar, then at my hands, which still trembled uncontrollably.
I had succeeded. I had banished the entity.
But something vital had been torn from me in the struggle, a part of my essence, a capacity for joy, perhaps, or for simple, uncomplicated peace. I had paid the cost. I was free, but I was also irrevocably broken. The silence, when it finally descended, was not a bomb. It was a suffocating shroud, heavier than any sound, pressing down with the weight of all that had been torn and twisted. The air, once thick with an unseen pressure, now tasted of dust and cold, a mineral tang that clung to the back of my throat like grave soil. I lay amidst the wreckage of what had once been my study, the meticulously ordered world of my cartography shattered into splinters and scattered parchment. The floorboards groaned beneath me, a skeletal symphony, echoing the cracks that had spiderwebbed across the plaster walls, across the very foundations of the house.
The entity was gone.
Or, perhaps, it had merely retreated, a predatory tide ebbing, leaving behind only the barnacled scars of its passage. My body was a symphony of aches, a discordant orchestra of bruised flesh and strained muscle. A jagged tear in my shirt exposed a long, crimson furrow across my ribs, a mark that stung with a deep, internal throb, not quite a cut, more like a burn, or a brand. I pushed myself up, each movement a protest from protesting joints, a wave of dizziness threatening to pull me back into the jagged embrace of the floor. The house was no longer a dwelling. It was a ruin, a monument to a silent war. The air itself seemed to hum with a residual tension, a memory of struggle, like the lingering vibrations of a snapped bowstring. I walked through the ravaged rooms, my footsteps crunching on shattered glass and fallen plaster, each sound amplified in the profound quiet. The ancestral portraits, once stern and watchful, now hung askew, their gazes unsettlingly vacant, their faces streaked with dust, as if they too had weathered the storm. It was not merely the memory of fear that lingered, but a new, unsettling understanding. The map, my map, suddenly seemed childishly naive, a mere sketch compared to the terrifying, living geography that now pulsed within my own perception. I saw not just the lines, but the hunger they represented. The sun had begun its slow, indifferent ascent by the time I stumbled out of the estate's main gates. The world outside was a muted watercolor, the sky a pale gray, the trees dripping with an early morning dew that seemed to mock the aridity within me. What had been etched into the land was now etched into me. The air was thick with a synthetic mist, a perpetual haze that clung to the rough-hewn pillars and the low ceiling. My boots scraped against the gritty asphalt, the sound reverberating, multiplying, until it seemed as though a legion walked beside me. Each echo was a phantom presence, a reminder that I was not truly alone, that the entity, or its ghost, or its lingering knowledge, was a constant companion. My eyes, once keen for the precise lines of a map, now seemed to pierce through the superficiality of the material world, seeing the hidden fissures, the faint, shimmering trails of energy that bound all things. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold metal of the car door. The touch sent a jolt, not of electricity, but of insight. I saw, for a fleeting moment, the car's journey, the hands that had built it, the countless miles it had traversed, the lives it had carried. It was too much, a deluge of unwanted information, a cartography of every object's hidden history. I snatched my hand back, my breath catching in my throat. The world had not ended, not for them, the silent, unsuspecting people whose lives unfolded beyond these fog-laced walls. The sun would rise again, appointments would be kept, laughter would ring out in mundane spaces. But for me, the world was irrevocably altered. I carried the scars, both visible and invisible, the deep-seated trauma that would forever define the before and after. And within me, a fragment, a shard of the entity's terrible understanding, lay dormant, waiting. It was not a victory, not truly. The world, when I finally permitted myself to rejoin it, felt thin, like a worn tapestry stretched too taut. Colors seemed muted, sounds muffled, as if a layer of invisible dust had settled over everything. My hands, once so certain with the delicate instruments of a cartographer, now trembled imperceptibly as I attempted to sort through old correspondence, the crisp edges of the paper feeling alien beneath my fingertips. The familiar scent of aged parchment and dry ink, once a comfort, now held a faint, metallic tang, a whisper of the cold earth. I tried to resume my work, to lose myself in the elegant curves of ancient coastlines and the precise hatching of forgotten mountain ranges. But the lines on the maps blurred, the landmasses seemed to writhe, and beneath the carefully rendered topography, I saw only the intricate, terrible patterns of what lay beneath. My mind, once a meticulous archive of historical data, now held a single, indelible image, the twisting, hungry void I had sealed, the price I had paid. The details of that final confrontation remained a jagged shard in the soft tissue of my memory, too sharp to fully grasp, too painful to ignore. And I remembered the quiet, agonizing surrender, the part of myself that had been offered, not as a sacrifice of blood or flesh, but of will, of essence. A quiet understanding had passed between me and the thing below, a terrible pact. Days bled into weeks. I ate, though food tasted like ash. My colleagues, when I eventually ventured back to the university, regarded me with a cautious pity. "You look tired, Reid," the department head remarked. The perpetual vigilance that now gnawed at the edges of my consciousness. One afternoon, a mundane errand pulled me into the city center. I needed to retrieve a forgotten box of research materials from a storage unit. A faint, acrid smell of oil and stagnant water clung to the air. I could not shake the feeling that I was not alone, that the echoes were not merely acoustic phenomena, but a response. The fog, a fine mist that seemed to rise from the very floor, obscured the furthest reaches of the cavernous space. Headlights of parked cars glowed like baleful eyes in the gray haze, their chrome surfaces beaded with moisture. I passed an abandoned shopping cart, its wheels rusted, a single, deflated football nestled within its wire cage. This was the world now, I realized. The lock clicked with an unnerving resonance in the echoing space. Inside, the familiar scent of old paper and forgotten things did little to soothe me. My research materials, meticulously organized, seemed quaint, irrelevant. What use were old maps when the true cartography of the world lay in the hidden currents beneath the soil, in the ancient, unbreathing things that slept and dreamed? As I closed the unit, the clang of the metal door reverberated, stretching into a low, mournful drone that seemed to vibrate in my very bones. I stood there, for a long moment, simply listening. It was not the sound of a rat, nor the drip of condensation. My breath hitched. My hand, without conscious thought, went to the small, intricately carved wooden compass I now wore around my neck, a relic from the estate, a constant weight against my skin.
I understood then. There was no normal life for me anymore.
My victory, if it could be called that, was not freedom, but a life sentence. I was the keeper of the seal, the silent guardian of the pact. The entity below still slept, its hunger merely sated, not extinguished. And I, Reid, the cartographer, was now bound to it, a subtle thread woven into my very being, ensuring its continued slumber, or perhaps, in some distant, terrible future, its reawakening.